Welcome back to episode 16 of the Rehab Exercise and Sports Therapy Rest podcast. For anyone, if you enjoy any of our podcast content today, please consider liking, subscribing, and reposting on any social media platforms, etc. I am really excited today to welcome Nicole Surdyka. Honestly, primarily because I get to geek out a little bit on soccer stuff or football, depending on if we have any international listeners. I'm going to hopefully assume that maybe we do. But she has a really exciting background, I think, both personally as a collegiate player and being in high performance and in general as an orthopedic physical therapist. So I'm really excited to get her take today on female athletes and ACL injuries. So Nicole, if you don't mind, I'll give you the platform to kind of give a little bit of your background and your role and kind of interests professionally.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Dan. So I grew up in New Jersey on the shore and grew up playing soccer. I'm in a big soccer family. My dad owns an indoor sports complex in New Jersey, so literally year round was just playing soccer. Every family party was 3v3 tournaments and pickup games that got a little too competitive at times. Um, So, yeah, I grew up playing soccer and ended up playing at St. John's University in Queens, New York. Had an amazing collegiate experience. When I was in college, there was no women's pro league, so there was no ever consideration for having a career in women's soccer. It wasn't
Yeah.
even a thought that could cross my mind at the time because it didn't exist.
Right.
So I went into college actually as a business major, but right before college, I fractured my tibia and fibula, had open reduction internal fixation. I still have an intermedullary tibial pin and had 3 screws that I eventually got taken out. But having to go through the physical therapy process myself, I was lucky enough to go to a place in New Jersey that specializes in athletes and in sports rehab. So my first run-in with physical therapy was very much an active sports type setting, and that made me realize how much I enjoyed that. And so I switched majors after my freshman year to bio. Um, Ended up taking a year off between undergrad and PT school, and I actually worked in that physical therapy clinic as an aide, and then went to Emory University in Georgia for physical
Yep.
therapy school. That's where I met my now husband, Mark. And uh, while in PT school, I really, my only kind of run in with physical therapy up to that point was very sports related. So that's all I thought physical therapy was. Started to see all the different facets of physical therapy in different realms. Of course, did the clinical rotations. But the whole time I was like, I really just want to work with athletes. Like,
Understood.
I don't
Yeah.
really want to do the rest of this.
Yeah. I had a very similar experience in high school where I was told, well, you need to do some intern hours in an acute care hospital setting. And the very first day I did it, I was helping the PT transfer a woman and she proceeded to urinate down my leg. And I said, nope, I'm good. I'm out. I'm sticking with orthopedics and sports medicine.
Not
So,
for me. Yeah.
yes.
So
And
after PT school, I didn't do a residency or anything. And I think that that's important for people to hear because I think, especially like as the years go on, I think there's so much of an emphasis. And I hear from a lot of students and new grads that they feel like they have to do a residency to get anywhere in their
yes.
careers. And again, I graduated over 10 years ago, so maybe it is like that now. And I know that you always need a way to get a leg up. But I also think it's important for people to hear, I've gotten to where I've gotten without having done one. I never sat for OCS or SCS. I still don't feel the need to.
Yep.
So, and again, maybe that's coming from a bit of a place of privilege at this point, having worked in pro sport, that I don't feel like I need to take that. And I do understand the struggle of younger clinicians feeling like they need to do something to get ahead.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's nice to hear from someone who hasn't taken that route.
Right. Definitely.
Um, yeah,
And after
so
hearing
yeah,
those
then
comments, I'm sorry. After hearing those comments, you're definitely been blacklisted by the APTA. So
I know, I know.
yeah,
That's okay.
yeah,
So, so then worked in a couple different clinics and then knew the whole time that was just when the NWSL was starting.
yeah,
You know, I'd reached out to a couple of teams. I was living in New Jersey right after, right after PT school, we moved to LA. My husband did a ortho residency actually.
yeah,
And so there we go. There's a little plug APTA. Someone successful did a
yeah,
residency.
yeah.
Um, then we moved back to New Jersey and I was reaching out to NWSL teams, like it was Sky Blue at the time, and just saying like, hey, I'll come volunteer, but I feel like you need a physical therapist. And there was just nothing, you know, crickets. They had part-time or volunteer athletic trainers in the beginning of the league, and that was about it.
Right.
So still didn't really see a path for working in pro women's soccer. You know, there had been two other iterations of women's professional soccer in the US before that, and they both failed and folded. And so kind of working under the assumption that, you know, why would this be any different? So started just kind of preparing myself as much as I could for the eventuality that there would be a successful women's league, or at the very least, you know, there's the U.S. women's national team. So kind of having that as the target.
Sure.
Yeah, ended up the NWSL has been successful, and I ended up working for Seattle Reign and had a great year there. It was crazy and insane, and probably everything and nothing that you expect about pro sport, both
Yeah.
at the same time. And then after that, I worked for Red Bull at the Athlete Performance Center in Santa Monica, working with the extreme sport athletes, and then also kind of consulting with and helping out with the New York Red Bulls from time to time, and some of the other Red Bull teams within that environment and ecosystem. And then my husband and I decided to move to Phoenix to be closer to family. And now I work at Phoenix Children's and have started my own education platform and network for people who work in women's soccer called Femme Football Collective.
Awesome. And I will make sure in the show notes, we make sure we include the links to some of that. As someone that has actually watched one of your webinars recently that you did about on-field soccer rehab, it's an excellent organization and probably long overdue to give female athletes the attention they deserve, both from a research standpoint and just general attention as far as hopefully some of the differences that we're going to tap into today in our discussion. So we'll make sure we include that. But I think you're doing some great work as far as kind of really promoting that and bring more the deserved attention to female athletes. So one of the
Thanks. Yeah,
reasons
I
we
felt
recruited
like,
you. Yeah.
yeah, I felt like everywhere I looked for deeper education on the population I was working with in women's soccer, it was all about men's soccer. You know, I was learning about things from the
Yes.
men's game and trying to apply it to the women's game. And yes, there's a research gap, but there is some research out there, which is how do we get it to people? So that's
Yeah.
kind of the mission of FemFC is continuing education, networking events, conferences, learning environments, specifically for people in women's soccer or interested in women's soccer.
Yeah. Awesome. And I will agree with you. Like I feel like the Europeans unfortunately have done a much better job than us as far as doing some of that research, soccer specific stuff, right? So it's good to see you kind of getting it here in the US and bringing it up to speed. So it's awesome.
Thanks.
You obviously have a very like diverse experience kind of at various stages along that orthopedic continuum. So our topic today was going to be ACL injury in female athletes, which we know like historically, I feel like there's been kind of an evolution of the research, right? Initially, there was a lot of focus on influence of the menstrual cycle and hormonal fluctuations and what that might do from a ligament laxity and injury risk standpoint. There's been a lot of attention paid to anatomical differences in females and what influence of wider pelvis, Q angle, that kind of thing might do. And then I know Tim Hewitt, Greg Meyer, their group has done a lot of research with respect to neuromuscular and biomechanical differences because we know, depending on who and what you read, right, female athletes are anywhere from like 3 to 8 times more likely to tear an ACL, right? You can tell me if I'm wrong on that
Nope, that's right.
data.
Yep.
Yeah, right. So tell me, in your mind, right, as we've seen the research evolve, what do you feel like from your perspective are some of the key drivers to that increase in ACL injury rate in female athletes?
Yeah, so you're right that there's kind of been an evolution, and I think it ends up being not a no but a yes and situation.
Yeah,
So
correct. Yeah.
yeah, so and I think that it's different for different athletes. I've seen the most powerful, strong, quick athletes tear their ACLs
Yep.
because they were producing more force than they could then decelerate with and control.
Sure.
And then I've seen the slower, more kind of type 1 muscle fiber dominant athletes tear their ACLs, maybe more along the lines of those biomechanical reasons.
Yeah.
So I think that any time that there is an injury, not just ACL, any injury in general, I think we have to think of it in terms of a whole system of that person and the context and the environment.
Sure.
And so, because there's players who could do a movement 1,000 times, and on the 1,001st time, they tear their ACL. So, what was
Sure.
it about that scenario that was too much for the ACL on that day, but not 3 days before when they did it, right? So,
Right.
I there's Kate Young did her PhD on kind of, or has released some papers on kind of systems thinking in
Yeah.
injuries. And if you think about it as being a pool of this like web of determinants, right? So this pool of variables that might contribute to an ACL injury. And on a given day, if too many of those variables kind of surface to the top, that's what creates an injury. So, yes, hormonal fluctuations can contribute, right? There is a legitimacy to that, in that
Sure.
if estrogen is spiked too high, it does increase ligamentous laxity, which does increase risk for ACL tears.
Right.
So we can't completely negate that. It is an aspect.
Right.
However, I think that for a long time, we were too comfortable with writing it off as that and saying, well, it's just, you know, females are females and their menstruals like, and we didn't really like, there wasn't enough research to like know anything really about this. It was just kind of an easy write off. Like,
Yeah.
okay, well, they menstruate, their hormones fluctuate. We don't know what's going on. It's probably that. We know estrogen increases ligamentous laxity. There we go.
Yeah.
And so I think for a long time that became the reasoning. And the problem with that is, again, yes, and yes, it can be a factor for some. And also, there are people who tear their ACLs across the menstrual cycle, across different phases. So it can't always be just the spike in estrogen that does that, because there are times that women will tear their ACLs in their luteal phase when progesterone is higher and not
Sure.
estrogen. And so, we can't just write it off as that. And then we need to go a step further. So now we're realizing, okay, well, it's not just this estrogen surge that's creating ACL injury risk. It can in some. Um, but then what are some other factors that might be at play? So then, there's this thought of, well, biomechanics, and that became a huge kind of trending topic. And
Right.
again, sure, maybe for some, it's one of those variables within that web of determinants that could potentially play a role. I don't think it is for all. I don't even think it's one of the primary risk factors, because what we know is that when an athlete, male or female, gets into that, it's been called in papers like the position of no return, right? That
Right.
dynamic knee
Dynamic
valgus.
valgus kind of.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Like that does happen, but often
Sure.
that sudden like snap in knee valgus is after the ACL tears. Like it
Right.
tears and then they go into that because they don't have the restraints anymore.
Yeah.
So the other thing with that is that there's been studies, I think back when like sports metrics was super popular. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
there are studies of doing it like a 8 to 12 week or even up to a 16-week biomechanical training protocol. And it didn't really change the way people move.
Right.
And that's
Yeah.
another thing is movement is so variable that to try to say one is normal and one's not is a really hard task and maybe not one that's worth the time and energy to do because normal for me might be not normal for someone else and neither of us are tearing our ACLs. So I think that then that started to become okay, well, maybe it's a role, but not as important as we thought. But really, what I'm getting at with all of these is whether it's hormones or Q angles or biomechanics, the thing that started to really bother me and a lot of researchers that have done a lot of good work in this since then is we can't change those things, right? And so now we're just blaming women for being women and
Right.
saying,
Yeah.
well, it's your own fault. Can't really do anything about it.
Yeah. Right.
Um,
Blame it on your mom and dad. Right. Yeah.
yeah,
Right.
exactly. So that's not really empowering for anyone. It's not empowering for athletes and it's not empowering for clinicians who want to try to reduce the risk of ACL injuries.
Yeah.
So that's what I really like about this, the gendered approach that's come out recently, and
Yeah.
really just looking at it through the lens of, well, how have girls been trained? Because there are the sex-based risk factors that we discussed that are legitimate.
Sure.
And then there's the gender-based, and the difference being how we treat girls and women through that societal lens of what it means to be a girl slash woman. And
Absolutely. Yeah.
so as girls are growing up, are we putting them in environments and situations where they're training as intensely or as professionally as boys, or being encouraged to and supported in having some of those like body to body contacts and just getting used to having that growing up? You
Yeah.
know, we're fine saying, oh, boys will be boys and let them wrestle in roughhouse, and girls don't necessarily play the same way. And that's fine, that's normal, but just understanding how that might impact athletic development. So I that's where I think I sit now is yes, and yes, the sex-based factors
Yes.
matter. And yes, these so-called gender-based factors matter in that how the training environments and the physical preparedness and physical literacy that young girls get is very different.
For sure. And I definitely you are actually setting me up perfectly for some of the topics I want to get into with you as we go
Great.
forward with this, because I want to try to hit on all of those different factors if we could. But I just wanted to get your take because I agree. Again, we can't just like throw it under one umbrella, right? It's kind of a multifactorial etiology of how of the injury and how all these things develop. But you hinted at it a little bit already, right? With this non-contact injury mechanism, right? We know this is where I get to kind of geek out on the soccer stuff a little bit, right? So we know that a huge percentage of ACL injuries now are happening like with defensive pressing maneuvers, right? All this like kind of reactive, unanticipated pressing, lunging, that are kind of consistent with some of those neurocognitive or sensory motor processing errors, we'll call it. I'm going to give a shout out to Dustin Grooms here for
Hmm.
some of that work that he's done, right? So tell me, do you see some differences now? Because it's come out in both males and females that that's kind of a common injury mechanism. Do you see some differences in the injury mechanism in females than you see in males from a soccer specific standpoint?
Yeah, I would say Francesco Della Via, who actually is a good friend of mine, put out some
Yep.
good studies of video analysis of mechanisms of injury, and he did it in both men and women, like two different studies. Actually,
Yes.
there are two studies in men and one in women. One was specifically in the Premier League.
Right.
Um, and there's a lot of similarities in them, right? It's still
Yes.
the pressing type of situation you were saying then is the most common.
Yeah.
And so where the differences are is so there's contact and non-contact, but
Right.
then non-contact can be broken down further into true non-contact or indirect contact.
Right. Where there's
And
like some sort of
in
perturbation, right? Or,
exactly.
yeah. Right.
And in men's soccer, it's a pretty even split between non-contact and indirect contact.
Right.
Whereas in women, in this study, again, we still need more data and research on this. But in
Right.
this study in women, the non-contact events still were more prevalent than indirect contact.
Yep.
Now, in things that I've seen, again, like the mechanism itself tends to still be that sudden deceleration that is reactive in nature. So
Right.
across the board, that tends to be it. I think something else that those studies, the video analysis studies showed was that men also have a higher prevalence for like landing being a mechanism. So maybe like
Yep.
going up for a header and then coming down and that being a mechanism. And then maybe in women, it was a little more common for them to tear their ACLs by regaining balance after kicking. Um, which that's actually how I fractured my tibia and fibula.
Oh.
But that was
Oh,
contact,
sorry. Yeah.
obviously. Um, from what I've seen, working with both female and male professional players, I've
Yeah.
kind of seen it across the board. I have seen more contact in the men's game than the women's game as being
Yeah.
a mechanism. But again, like that's not the primary mechanism.
Sure.
Just haven't really seen that in the women's game at all, really, in my experiences. But yeah,
Yeah.
I think indirect contact tends to be the most common. I know that this data set showed non-contact still was more prevalent than indirect for women.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I would like to see more research done in that and get more
Sure.
data on that.
Yeah, and I'll link the Francesco Del Villa is with Isokinetic Medical Group, right, over in Europe. And he and Mac Buckthorpe, especially, yeah, have done some really great things as far as research with knowing injury mechanism, that kind of thing. So I wanted to kind of segue there, Nicole, if we can. Do you feel, from your standpoint, like if you know the injury mechanism, do you feel like that can really help you as far as informing what you need to address from either a rehab or injury prevention standpoint going forward?
Yeah, it's something that I definitely care to know about.
Yeah.
And this is not supported in research. This is not like a data-driven thing. This is kind of
Sorry,
just
you
my
can give
my
your theoretical perspective. Yeah,
yeah,
that's fine.
exactly.
Yeah,
My
right.
theory and kind of like my feel for it is
Yeah.
whenever I'm doing an eval or I'm working with an athlete who's just torn their ACL and if it was a contact mechanism, I'm a little bit less worried about that second,
Yeah.
like the re-injury risk, just
Yeah, there's
because,
nothing you can do about those, right? I mean, yeah,
yeah,
those are just like really bad luck, right? I feel like.
exactly.
Yeah.
And maybe there's something about like, okay, let's see if we can make you quicker so you're not in that situation or
Yeah,
a
right.
smarter player, you're not putting yourself in those scenarios. But yeah, I tend to be like, okay, it was non-contact, or it was contact. I'm not quite as concerned. It seems in my mind a little bit more straightforward of a rehab then, like, okay, just
Yes.
kind of restore everything and there's nothing that we need to like go back and like fix or reprogram, like there's nothing like
Yeah.
there's maybe not those things leading into the injury that, like you said, like could have been maybe mitigated.
Yeah.
So that to me, again, it's not really supported by anything. It's just my theory.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, so you definitely have enough, again, you gave your bio, right? You definitely have an informed, diverse experience right now to kind of provide that perspective. So, yeah.
Yeah. And
Um,
then I do think it's helpful to know I don't know, besides what I just said, aside from that, I don't know how much the rest of it necessarily informs. Like rehab, you still have to do a good rehab, right?
sure.
Maybe you start to consider towards the end, like the neurocognitive like processing errors, maybe you start to consider that as you're looking at return to sport. I
Yeah.
think it might be important to think about in terms of how we program and how we address like injury prevention mechanisms. So working within a team setting, if you know over the past 2 seasons you've had 3 ACL tears and the mechanisms were similar or something about them, there is some kind of similarity. again, the data set is too small to say it's for sure a pattern, but
Yeah.
maybe within your club, you're like, okay, like, is there something we can address here to decrease the risk for next season?
Yeah.
So I think in a team level or in a team setting, that's how I would approach it if I'm seeing, mechanisms that are similar or any kind of similar variable in those mechanisms.
Sure.
Um, but then I really just think that knowing what the demands of the sport are and then preparing the athlete for that, like
Yeah.
you don't need much more than that in a good rehab and a good injury prevention program.
Yeah. I think like from my relatively uninformed perspective, you mentioned the difference between indirect and true non-contact, right? I look at like true non-contact as like, okay, this person maybe just needs to work on their physical qualities, right? From a deceleration standpoint or that kind of thing, to be able to control those forces and absorb it better. Some of the indirect, mechanisms, I feel like, okay, for this person, I definitely want to make sure I am including maybe a bigger percentage of neurocognitive rehab in that later return to sport phase, that kind of thing, as we get more into that. Like you said, everybody should, you're treating what you see, right? You're continually reassessing, and everybody should get a comprehensive rehab program, right? But I just, in the back of my mind, when I'm doing that, I want to make sure that, like, as I'm kind of developing my checklist and kind of reverse engineering things, I feel like to some extent knowing that injury mechanism can be helpful from that standpoint. So.
Yeah, and I think you're touching on something that I wholeheartedly agree with, which is the individualization of it and
Yes.
knowing what that individual needs. So when I was with Rain, we had two athletes who tore their ACLs right around the same time. Of course, they tore it during the COVID bubble tournament, and there were all of those other contextual factors involved,
Yeah.
which made it
Right.
more complicated. But as I mentioned, one of the players was a strong, fast, powerful attacking player. The other one
Yeah.
was an endurance-based midfielder player. And
Sure.
so they had their surgeries like within a week or two of each other. And
Okay.
so as we're going through the rehab, initially goals are the same, right? Like restore range of
Sure.
motion, minimize pain and swelling, restore strength. Then as we started to get into more, like they have their kind of foundational strength and we're getting more towards power and pure strength and incorporating some on-field rehab. I really had to fine tune and adjust their rehabs to suit each one of them as individuals
Yeah.
because one of like the fast, powerful one, hers was an indirect contact mechanism where she was just going, she's really fast. She was going way too fast, way faster than she could control. Had a little like shoulder bump, and then her like next step after that tore her ACL.
Yeah.
So that's very different than the other player who was just cutting non-contact and tore her ACL. And so um, how I then approached it once we got past a certain level did have to be slightly different. One, based on mechanisms, maybe, but I think the mechanisms just spoke more to what they looked like as athletes.
Sure. Yeah. That's where, yeah, I completely agree with the kind of customization to each individual, right? I mean, we have certain benchmarks we need to hit, but obviously, everybody's got different kind of genetic predispositions to certain qualities, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. And like you
Uh,
said, everyone is like, there's the benchmarks to hit, but how you get there is maybe what you change for each
for
athlete.
sure. Yes. Yeah. Everybody's kind of time frame to reach those may be a little different for sure.
Hmm.
So Nicole, you touched on something that I wanted to kind of hit a little earlier, especially with kind of growing up with your history and that kind of thing. And we know this could be a whole separate conversation, right, about the whole youth sports specialization culture and that kind of thing right now, which I feel like in soccer is especially prevalent, right? There's this trend towards at an early age, really focusing on kind of year-round soccer, which I think, and especially from a technical skill development standpoint, I think is great, right? Like I look at some of the kids now. My son has played club for too long, and I look at the kind of skill level across the board of some of these kids. I think it's way higher than I grew up. In fact, not that I think, I'm 100% guarantee it's way higher. But I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about kind of the percentage of time now spent for some of these kids, especially in maybe some of this at-risk time frame, like early adolescence to like high school time frame, where a big percentage of these injuries happen? What are your thoughts on the time spent with playing games and technical training for clubs versus time spent from a strength conditioning standpoint, especially from a female athlete perspective? I wanted to kind of get your take. What do you see as far as some of the girls that and the females that you have treated, and your kind of general sense?
Yeah, so I will preface this by sharing my experience growing up because otherwise I'll feel like a hypocrite. So
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
my my parents tried to make me try every sport. Like they signed me up for softball, volleyball. Like they made me try everything.
Yes.
Again, my dad owned an indoor sports complex, and in the summer there would be like this multi-sport camp, and
Camps.
so
Yeah.
we would do, soccer, then basketball, then volleyball,
Yeah.
then maybe like field-based movements and stuff, which actually, like in retrospect, that was really forward thinking of them to be doing in the 90s.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
um, but I hated every other sport. Like I
Yeah.
hated playing every other sport. I am competitive. I know this about myself. I liked soccer largely in part because I was good at it. And so I, from a young age, like I'm talking like maybe 9, 10 years old, told them, no, I'm only playing soccer. So I need to preface that because as I talk about specialization, I need to not be a hypocrite and share like, okay, I specialized early. However,
Yes.
what that looked like in the 90s is very different than what it looks like in
For sure.
2025. So
Yes.
I still had, yeah, and I did play year round. I was always, but I played a lot more pickup games and games in a backyard and no
Yes.
coaching, no rules. I played freeze tag and kick the can outside with my cousins on the weekends. Um, there was there are even our PE classes, I feel like,
Yeah.
we were exposed to a lot of different things. And so I still developed a bit of a wider literacy in my physicality,
Yeah.
in my physical development. Also, I started kind of like strength and conditioning programming when I was in high school. There was somebody who worked in my dad's facility who had a gym and was a really great actually like a great strength and conditioning coach, and so I was working with him a couple days a
Yeah.
week. So if you're going, my point there is if you're going to choose one sport, number one, it needs to be the child's choice. Like it can't be the parent or a coach demanding that of them.
Right.
We know how high the dropout rates are, especially once they hit girls around the age of like 14 or so. Their dropout rates are twice as high as boys.
Yeah.
And I think a big part of that is like that pressure of, well, you need to choose. You need to tell me what sport you're going to do the rest of your life. And that's crazy.
Right.
So it needs to be the child's choice if they're going to only do one sport. In addition to that, you need to find other ways to develop their physical literacy as they're developing. So if that's putting them in S&C classes, if that's, I guess kids don't really play outside as much anymore, but if it's, just finding some way to do that. If it's making them go do a gymnastics or a dance class twice a week, like just doing something that isn't the same movements over and over again for 12 hours a week. So that's my caveat to like, if you're going to
Yeah.
specialize, that's how you do it. Now, having
Okay.
said that, of
Yeah.
course, like the best way of developing, again, I'm going to keep saying physical literacy because that's genuinely what it is. It's
Yeah.
being able to have more than one motor solution to a problem, because that's what
Yeah.
movement is. It's I have to get from here to there to the soccer ball before my opponent does, and then I have to kick it over there. That's the problem. Now, if I only have one pathway of doing that
Solve that. Yeah.
ingrained in me, then what happens when something goes awry and there's something within my system or within the environment that doesn't allow me to do it that way? I don't have any other things. I don't have any backup routes. Like there's no plan B, C, or D.
Yeah.
And so I think that's maybe where some injury risk comes into play. I also think that's where some overloading comes into play is you're just doing the same things repetitively over and over, and especially on growing bodies. I just I fail to see the importance of that or the value in doing that. So, of course, the
Agreed.
recommendation would be play multiple sports, right? But
Yeah.
I also get the reality of it and today's world. So I would say if you're going to specialize, make it the kid's choice and get
Yes.
them in some kind of S&C course.
Awesome. Okay. I mean, like I said, we could go on to that for hours. And like I said, as a parent, I see both sides of it. As a parent of a
Mm-hmm.
club soccer player, like I understand there's a huge financial outlay, right? And parents want to feel like, well, we're gonna squeeze every cent we can out of this. So we're gonna go to as many technical training sessions and not gonna and playing as many games and tournaments as we can to feel like, we get some return on our investment. But like I said, if it's at the expense, like you said, of that kind of broader motor literacy and broader, I think it was like a broader motor library, right? And like you said, different strategies to draw from and different physical qualities and skills, then I think, like you said, in a lot of ways, we're doing a disservice. And I understand also that there's this pressure now with specialization, right? Like I'll give on the boys side, and I know it's a little different as far as the female pathway for soccer specialization, that kind of thing. But on the boys side, there's MLS Next, right, where you are kind of contractually bound, right? If you sign up for MLS Next, you are not playing any other sports, right? Because again, the club is making a huge financial investment in you. But again, it's like, is that on some level a disservice to the kids? So, you know,
Yeah, and I think, like I used to give the example of, okay, the 2019 US Women's National Team who won the Women's World Cup. Most of the players on that team, in fact, I want to say almost every player in the main like starting 11 didn't specialize in soccer until high school or later.
right?
Um,
Yep.
However, the landscape of women's soccer is changing,
Change it. Yeah.
and there's teenagers playing in the NWSL now.
Right.
And so as there's increased professionalization, like you're saying, I understand the desire for parents to want to squeeze everything out of that system and okay, well, I'm paying this much, you might as well get everything you can out of
Yeah.
it.
Right. Yeah.
So that's a reality, and I don't want to neglect that and act like, we're back in the 90s where you could play multiple sports and it's just one
Yeah.
season each.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I think with the professionalization, as long as it's genuine professionalization in terms of also offering support and resources for a well-rounded holistic strength and conditioning program, that's where I think maybe there's a bit of a difference. So, like an example would be in England, the average age of a men's first team player in the Premier League, the average age that they got into a professional environment was like 9, 10 years old, being in the academy system. And that's kind of what you're alluding to with MLS Next is this pathway system that exists
Yeah.
on the men's side, albeit it's better in Europe than it is here still.
For sure. Yes.
um,
Right.
but they're exposed to high level coaching and resources, nutrition, sports psychology, physical
Yes.
therapy, S&C, etc.
Yeah.
The average age of players in the Barclays Super League in England, they didn't enter a genuinely professional environment until 16, 17, 18.
Right.
So the amount of years that they've had access to those things is far less. And that goes back to kind of what we first talked about with risk factor for injury and having those resources available from a younger age on the boys' side and not having it until maybe it's a little bit too late on the girls
Yeah.
and the women's side.
Right. Yeah. And the other thing I've observed, and I don't know again what your thoughts are on this is, unfortunately for some of these kids, again, that may get injured that are in that pathway is like all of a sudden when they get injured, and you have to remove them because that becomes like their world, right? When they've specialized for a long time, and that becomes like their peer group, their friend group, and they're traveling every weekend to different locations. All of a sudden, if they get injured and they're not doing that anymore, it's it's a dark place for them from a depressive standpoint when they get injured. So, it's tough. I understand the pros and the cons kind of being on both sides. So I just wanted to get your thoughts about what you see on the female side of things.
Yeah, it's funny. When I was in PT school, I was also coaching at one of the most premier girls soccer academies in the country. It's Top Hat in Georgia, in
Yeah.
Atlanta. And so I was coaching there, and simultaneously in school, I was working on a like kind of independent research review in school on injury prevention programs. And was reading all this research about it and like, oh, wow, there's actually a lot out here and they seem to be effective. And then I would go and coach and nobody's doing any of them.
Nope. Yeah.
And I was like, wait, what's the disconnect here? I know that these things exist and are helpful. Why are like this is one of the top clubs in the country for girls. Like and it wasn't just there. Like I've also coached in New Jersey and California and
Yeah.
same thing, no one's doing them. So that's what got me really passionate about like
Invested.
sharing
Yeah.
information from like, okay, that's actually why I started my Instagram back in whatever year I started. It was I just wanted to get information of like what I was reading in academic journals to people who need to actually utilize it.
Yeah. So that is the perfect segue because I wanted to get into that because I feel like you said, I'm going to give a shout out to Holly Silvers, right, for developing PEP program back. I think that was in the 90s, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or early 2000s, and showing again that it's successful when it's implemented, right? And I think FIFA 11 has kind of piggybacked and capitalized on that, right, to make it very soccer specific. But it's only successful if you implement it, right? And there's definitely barriers, as you mentioned, like a lot of places aren't using it. So in your mind, right, what do you feel like? What are some of the barriers to implementing it on the soccer side of things from a coaching and club standpoint? Um, and what do you feel like are some of the barriers to success with that? Like from what you've seen and being involved firsthand, what do you feel like are the keys to making programs kind of more palatable and implementable? I'll put it that way.
Yeah, I think some of the barriers are one in youth soccer are field space,
Yeah,
and time. And so, or the perception of time is more accurate, I think.
yeah,
And so I think that youth coaches hear like injury prevention program and one think, well, I'm not qualified to do that. Like that's not,
yeah.
and two, it's listen, I'm on a half of a field that I have from 6 to
90
7:15
minutes.
p.m. And then
Yeah,
yeah,
right. Yeah,
exactly. And I, have things that we need to work on for the upcoming game. And
sure.
so I certainly understand that. And again, I say the perception of time because I think that it's this idea of like now I got to spend, half of or a third of my session, if they think it's this 30-minute thing, that's literally a third of their session or half of their session doing this thing where there's no soccer ball.
Right.
And so those are reasonable issues to take with them.
Sure.
And so everything comes down to education. And again, I don't think we as academics, as physical therapists, as healthcare professionals have done a good enough job of getting information to the people who need to implement it in a digestible enough way.
Yeah.
So what we should have done back in the 90s when all of this was coming out was going to US soccer and saying, hey, in every single coaching education course in each of the states, because they're at a certain, like, the earlier coaching license levels or like the initial ones are led by state and local soccer. So like for
Yes.
example, it would be like, yeah, like New Jersey Youth Soccer Association.
Yeah.
Um, Sometimes it's even broken down to like county level.
Yeah.
So making sure that each of those at the grassroots level are being taught. And I've been to a number, I have a coaching license or from New Jersey, and I've been to a number of those courses. And it's funny, it was I went the last one I went to was maybe like 8 or 9 years ago after I was already a physical therapist. And they knew I was a physical therapist. And so as we're going through and talking and doing the course, they would ask me questions because now they are teaching part of like the FIFA 11 plus warm up.
Yes. Right.
And they would ask me, they're like, oh, like, is this, why is this important? Or like, can we do this instead? Or, asking my input on things. And I'll never forget the instructor asked me, yeah, so what age, they asked the class, what age should we start these warm up programs with? And people were like, I don't know, 8, 9, like when they start soccer. And the instructor was like, no, we don't really need to start them until like 13, 14 years of age. And I was like, no, no, no. No,
Right.
no.
Hold on.
Hang on. Rewind. No, we need to start it like why would we not start at 8? And their reasoning was, well, 8-year-olds don't need to warm up. I was like, true, but that's not the point. Like the point is to teach to teach the habit of it, right? Like,
Right.
okay, we're just gonna get into the habit of doing this injury prevention program or this warm up that helps reduce the risk of injuries, whatever, however you want to refer to it.
Yeah.
It gets the kids in the habit, it gets coaches in the habit, and it's starting to develop those skills, those movement skills from a younger age. If someone's 13, 14 years old, they've already developed a lot of that. So,
Right.
the older players get, the more of a ceiling effect there is. That's why, when we talk about implementing it, and there's still more barriers to implementing at the youth level. But at the
Yeah.
pro level, most teams aren't doing like the FIFA 11 plus because the players are in their 20s and 30s. It needs to be a little more specific in their warm-ups.
Right.
So yeah, those are some of the barriers. Now, I used to teach a continuing education course called Managing the Uninjured Soccer Player, and a big part of it was this warm up and making it more palatable and how do we coach coaches on how to do it.
Yeah.
And one thing that this is my philosophy on it is, okay, if we take the components of what makes these injury prevention programs successful, so it's a level of, warming up, some dynamic stretches, some, you know, they're not really plyometrics, but they like bounding, hopping, things like
Yeah.
that. And then some strengthening. So Nordics, Copenhagen's, that's some squats and heel raises. So those are the components of a successful program, and this has been studied. I think Amy Arundel put out a
Yeah.
CPG about this so a while back, and so if you just take those components, now you can make a youth soccer warm up that includes a soccer
The
ball.
ball. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So a common youth soccer warm up is like there's a circle or a grid and the players are dribbling around and then the coach will say like switch soccer balls with someone,
Right.
or
Yeah.
the number thing like to teach them to look up while they're dribbling, like how
Yeah.
many fingers am I holding up, or like what color there's already good things going on at these levels. It's just now can we have a little more intentionality behind that
For
and
sure.
include some of these aspects, like let's have them hop over the ball on one leg and at the same time give them cues that any soccer coach could use. And this is what coaching courses should be teaching is, okay, because this is one of the barriers. Coaches are like, well, I'm not a physical therapist, so I'm not an S&C coach, I'm not a bio, I don't know what to say to them. Like I just have them do it and I don't know how to correct the movement.
Yeah.
There's very simple cues that we can teach coaches to coach kids on.
Yeah. And it's a lot of it's no different than if they were just on a playground, like doing hopscotch or that kind of thing, right? You're just integrating and making it more soccer specific, right? So,
Exactly.
um, it's funny because you bring it up about the warm up, right? I just saw a study yesterday or the day before. Now, granted, it's in professional women's soccer, right? But the percentage of when the injuries were occurring during the game, right? And proportionally, like absurdly higher during like the first 20, 30 minutes of the game, of the match, right? So, I, yeah, I think that just points to like how critical it is to really ensure that we are doing a good warm up, right? With, like I said, intentionality to it, to really try to kind of prep them for some of the specific movements and things they may encounter during the game, to really kind of prime the nervous system to maybe limit or mitigate some of the non-contact stuff. So
Yeah, I think that as well as in our programming, injury prevention programming or S&C programming, whatever,
yeah,
is preparing them for those high, because the first 30 minutes of the game are the most intense, unless, towards the end you're chasing something. But
right.
earlier on, that's when people are, you know, sprinting faster, covering more
Sure.
distance, so
Yeah.
I think preparing for those more intense moments and training for those is also a benefit, going to be beneficial for that.
So, Nicole, you mentioned the, growing up doing some strength conditioning stuff, and maybe kind of the disparity in female athletes then and even now, I would say, in what they're doing from a strength conditioning standpoint versus boys or males, right? So tell me, like, what do you think are some of the key elements, just as on general principle, for female athletes that should they include in a strength conditioning program? What are like the bare minimum essentials you feel like they should be addressing?
Yeah, I would say if you're doing it with boys, you can do it with girls, right? Like there's no
Absolutely. Right.
research
Yeah.
to suggest that like they need to be trained any
Any
differently,
differently. Yeah.
especially at that level.
Yep.
Um, so from a basic standpoint, I would say twice a week, make sure you get a squat pattern, hinge pattern, and then specifically targeting quads, hamstrings, adductors, calves. Like those would be, and hip flexors.
Yeah.
Those would be like my top priorities.
Okay.
So yeah, I generally program, like I said, like squat pattern, hinge pattern, and then Nordics, Copenhagen's. It doesn't have to be those things. I just think that they're easy to
Implement.
do with
Yeah.
minimal equipment.
Yeah.
That's kind of what's always in my mind as well, is like what's what remove as many barriers as possible, right? So if they need like the specialized equipment, it might not get done. So that's what I like about Copenhagen's and Nordics and reverse Nordics for that matter, and then just a heel raise.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I start with that. And then, yeah, and then if you're going to be working with them in person, like it's different. Like here's a general recommendation, like hoping that they do it at home on their own, or
Yeah.
you're a youth soccer coach and maybe doing some of these things with your team at the end of practice. With some of the strengthening stuff, obviously doing the warm up at the beginning. Um, but if you're going to be working with youth athletes, I would say, teach them these foundational movement patterns, get them doing things, double leg, split stance, single leg, and then start adding it, like keep it simple at first and then progress them the same way you would with any athlete really, but you need to develop those foundational movement skills first. So maybe the squat is just a goblet squat to start with, and then progressing the way that you would progress a squat in any other population.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you the same question as far as like post-op rehab. If you have a female athlete that's torn an ACL, do you feel like there's some key differences that we should include for female athletes that maybe again are subtly different than males, or again you're just looking at it as customize it to the individual. Each individual is going to be different, so make sure you just kind of assess comprehensively and then tailor it to them? Or do you feel like there's some things across the board that you see that we should kind of make sure we sneak in on a routine basis for female athletes?
Yeah, I'd say first and foremost is always the individual in front of you
Yeah.
and what you're seeing and what they're needing, the type of athlete that they are. And there are some kind of generalities that I've seen. So there's emerging research and starting to get, you know, decent research on the fact
Work done.
that, yeah, like potentially female athletes are better able to tolerate higher volume of loading,
Mhm.
whereas male athletes maybe tolerate higher intensity of loading a little bit better.
Okay.
And so I actually saw a presentation by Carol Mack last summer at the Elite
Oh yeah.
Soccer Rehab Conference,
Yeah.
and
Which I
she
think
was
you helped
saying,
organize, by the way, right?
I did, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I'll give you
So,
a little shout out for that. Again, we'll plug as many things as we can for you, right? So yeah.
yes. So I selfishly asked her to present because I wanted to hear what she had to say.
Yeah, sure. Right.
um, which is the benefit of organizing that is you get exactly what you want.
You get to hear that.
Um,
That's why I do this podcast, right? I get to talk to people that
exactly.
have
I
like
hear
all this
you.
expert knowledge and just like try to soak it up as much as I can.
Exactly. But
Yeah.
so she gave a great presentation about how we're potentially underloading female athletes in rehab. And it's
Okay.
probably twofold. I think one might be maybe some unconscious bias of it's a female athlete, we don't need to load it that heavy. I'd like to think that that's going away a little bit and that
Yeah.
that paradigm is shifting. However, we can't completely ignore the fact that that might exist at some level for some people.
Yeah.
So that's one side of it. But then the other side is to research that, yes, potentially female athletes, their interset rests don't need to be quite as long, or maybe they're able to tolerate 4, 5, 6 sets of something. Whereas maybe the male athlete you're working with is better tolerating 3 sets of that same thing or 2 sets. And again, that would be matched for intensity. So the male athlete would most likely be lifting at a little bit of a higher intensity than the female athlete just compared to their body mass. And but yeah, I think that was it. That was kind of like eye-opening for me, her research, like, oh wow,
Yeah.
am I underloading some of my female athletes in rehab by giving the same rep and set ranges as the male athletes?
Yeah. Right. That's interesting. I hadn't heard that before. Like it's like if you talk to Dan Lorenz, like we're underloading everyone, right? And I
That's
kind of,
true.
I'm fully in agreement with him because I feel like some of the constraints I see in here with some of my athletes, especially some of the ACLs, right? A lot of the percentage of athletes that I see that have torn are the ones we talked about that have like specialized in sports but are not doing any training or strength conditioning, right? So they have a very limited training history. And sometimes I feel like getting them to know, like we're using RPE, for instance, right? Like this is what a 7 actually is on your RPE. And I know you feel like, like you're maxed out at this weight, but if you feel like you can do 100 reps at that weight,
Yeah.
then you're not actually working as hard as you should be. So yeah, I feel
Yes.
like that's hard sometimes is kind of getting them attuned to like the intensity they should actually be at. So
Yeah, and that actually comes out when we do handheld dynamometry testing is
yeah.
when I first start, like the first 1 or 2 times that an athlete, especially an adolescent athlete, will do that is, I do 50% and then 75 to 90% effort to kind of warm them up and get
Mhm.
them thinking about like pushing more. And then when I say, okay, do 100% effort, we'll do 3 to 5 trials. And let's say the first trial, they get like 600 newtons. Then the second one, they get 780 newtons. And then the
Yeah.
third one, they're at 500 newtons. I'm like, what? Like, there's so much
Inconsistent. Yeah.
variability that I'm like, you just don't know what 100% effort is. Like you just don't know what that looks like or what that feels like. And I think that feeds into what you're saying with like, this is actually what going to failure is.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I know I've kept you for an hour, and I feel like I could continue to like throw a million more things at you, but I don't want to take up all of your day. So, Nicole, tell us if you could a little bit about any other kind of personal aside, professional projects you're interested in, or things you're doing right now, and we'll make sure we include that stuff in the show notes.
Yeah, so like I mentioned before, Femme Football Collective or FemFC is kind of my new business and passion project. Website should be live in the next couple of weeks, but it will have blog, webinars. I have a podcast. The podcast is live, so you can start listening to that, and it's all geared towards educating people working in women's soccer. And the tagline is elevating the game, empowering the experts, because I genuinely believe that the more we can empower the medical and performance staff, the higher the level of the game can reach. We need the best players out there performing at their best in order to continue to grow the women's game. And we're the ones who support that and do that. So you can check out the podcast. It's called FemFC Podcast, new episodes every Wednesday. You can also watch the episodes on YouTube. Be on the lookout for femfc.com, the website where you'll find blogs. And then I'm doing monthly webinars. And like you mentioned, the on-field rehab webinar I did, there's a goalkeeper rehab webinar coming up in November that I'm really excited about. I've got 2 people from the MLS and then my coworker at Phoenix Children's presenting on that because I am not a goalkeeper. And then next summer
a little
we've got
different
the
mentality for the keepers.
very different, yeah. And then the whole upper body that I just not my thing. And then next summer we've got the Soccer Performance Support Summit, and that's bringing together speakers from both the men's and the women's game. The theme of the conference is what can the men's and women's games learn from each other? And it goes a little bit deeper than a typical conference where you're just sitting and listening to presentations. There will be workshops, there will be practical sessions, there will be roundtable discussions. And so I'm really excited for that. I know it's going to be such a great event. It's in my hometown, so I'm looking forward to that as well.
Awesome. Well, you have been an awesome guest, and thank you for offering your perspective. Like I said, your passion for all things soccer and female athlete definitely comes through in all your projects and hearing you talk. So thanks again for your time. And I will definitely follow up with you later.
Well, thank you so much, Dan.
All right. Thanks, Nicole. Take care.
Bye.